Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to yet another part in the saga of the King of the Rusted Crown. At this point I have worked for almost 4 months on this one project, and I'm finally pretty close to having a functional mold of my sculpture. So this time we're going to talk about the hydro resin mother mold. As usual, I'll start off by plugging my Patreon page. If you'd like more personal feedback on your own work or would like to support me in making these videos, check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below. We're at 21 patrons at the moment, and once we reach 25 there will be a reward for the first 25 patrons. So if you'd like to get in on that, look at the link in the description below. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me explain what's going on here. Because this is a very complex shape, I can't get away with a simple two-piece mother mold. A lot of times you can. One piece of the mother mold per piece of silicone, usually two. In this case, that would have been the front and the back. But because this piece is very complex with plenty of undercuts, I need to create a mother mold that is made up of several pieces. In the end, there will be 7 pieces to the front part of my mother mold and 3 pieces to the back part of my mother mold. I won't show you all the pieces here, because there's a lot of repetition, to be honest, and I forgot to film some of them. Just know that the principles are repeatable to whatever mold you are making. I've started off by creating a clay wall that will separate the first piece I'm going to make from the rest of the pieces. In the beginning, when there is no other pieces up, you have to create a border for your piece out of clay. You want to make sure the clay wall is as clean as possible to allow for as good registration as possible between the pieces. And I think the height I make these walls are about 6 to 8 centimeters, or around 3 inches. I make them this tall to make it easy to drill holes and run bolts through them later on. The best way for the pieces of mother mold to hold together is by simply bolting them together. Another important thing to consider is the way your mother mold is going to come apart. It is like a puzzle, and one piece should be the easiest one to remove first, and then the other pieces will come out one by one. So to control this, the angle that your clay wall is built at becomes important, so the pieces don't lock together. As you can see with my first piece, I angled the horizontal part of the wall downward, which makes this piece the one that will come off easier than the one above it. This makes sense, at least to me, because this piece is at the bottom of the mold and only butts up against a piece in 2 directions, being free in the other 2 directions. So this is a good piece to make sure will come off first, because it's not locked in all directions, right? The material I'm using has no brand name that I'm aware of. The bucket it comes in it's white and it says hydro resin, and that's really about it. But it works very similar to other enhanced plasters I've tried, like aqua resin that you can easily get in America, or jesmonite, which you can get in the UK. This, however, is the one that we can get from our provider here in Florence, so it's the one I'm using. The material comes with powder and liquid, and the mix ratio is really flexible, and I essentially mix it based on the consistency that I need for the job that I'm trying to do with it. So for the first layer, the splash coat, which needs to capture details, I mix a fairly thin layer. Maybe like a thick soup or something like that. Still liquidy, but way thicker than water. Other layers will need different consistencies. It's a great material because of its flexibility. It's hard to mess things up with this material, as far as mix ratio and things like this. And you can clean it easily off your hands and brush with water, and yet water doesn't really inhibit the curing at all. Now you can see me using gloves because this stuff is very sticky, so it'll stick to your nails and it's super hard. So it's not like plaster, which will kind of crack off your nails, but this stuff will really stick to it. And this is the only downside as far as I can tell. The fact that the material, once set up, is so hard, which is one of its greatest assets. But if you don't know how to make a mold, well, this material can really mess up your sculpture. So I think it's good to get comfortable making mother molds with plaster first, because plaster is a lot easier to work with, especially if you will be making mistakes, which I think you will once you're just starting out. And if you make a mistake and your mother mold is locked onto your sculpture, with plaster you can get it off, but with this stuff, good luck. It's way too strong and you will likely ruin your sculpture in the process. But with plaster you can break it apart a lot easier without damaging your sculpture too much. Hydro resin and enhanced plasters in general are also very expensive, so this material is for more experienced mold makers who know, more or less at least, what they're doing. Once the splash coat sets up and is hard, you can apply 2 layers of fiberglass. The fiberglass weave we buy here in Florence, it's not very fine, so it doesn't lay down too well. So it'll take some attempts to figure out how to lay the fiber down. I brush a fresh coat of resin on the area where I'm going to be laying my fiber down, and then I wet the fiber on a piece of aluminum. I wet it on both sides, and then I apply it to the mold, making sure that there is 0 air between my fiberglass and my splash coat. Because if there's air, the splash coat will easily break from the inside, creating a hole in my mold, which we don't want, of course. When I cast sculptures out of this, I use 1 layer of fiber, but when I make mother molds I use 2, and this makes your mold incredibly strong, so it's probably never going to break. On the first piece here I messed up a little bit and ran out of space on my SD card, so I missed several steps, but you'll see the next few steps on another piece, so just know that there are more steps to this process. So for the next piece I still need to make a clay wall, but not all the way, because part of this piece will butt up against the wall that we made on the first piece. It's very important to note that anything you don't want the next piece to stick to needs to be covered in Vaseline. So it won't stick to the silicone and it won't really stick to the clay, but it'll stick like crazy to most things, like the wooden board for example. And the first piece that I already made needs to be really Vaseline, otherwise it will stick. And if you don't Vaseline, it probably won't come apart. This material is somewhat unlike plaster in that regard, that it will always stick to itself like crazy, and it never gets too dry for a proper connection, which can happen if plaster gets old. So that can make it somewhat more forgiving to work with as well if you need to retouch an old cast or something like that. But it also means that you really have to be careful about Vaselining the old parts if you don't want them to stick. Okay, so I splash coat again and applied 2 layers of fiber, and I did this off camera this time. Then we get to applying extra thickness to the walls. I put fiberglass maybe halfway up, or maybe a little bit more up the walls, to make them really strong and make them integrated into the rest of the piece. To achieve the thickness of the wall, I mix a thicker mix of hydro resin and apply it with a spatula. I try to make it as square as possible because this makes it strong all the way from the bottom to the top. So by square I mean even thickness, all the way from the bottom of the wall to the top. Because it's through these walls that I will drill holes and run bolts, so most of the stress will be concentrated here, which is why I make them the thickest and strongest part of the mold. It takes a bit of practice, and sometimes I'll do 2 batches so I don't have to rush through this. If you have time, you should always make the prettiest mold you can possibly make. Perhaps someone else will handle your mold for you, a foundry or something, and if the mold is full of jags and sharp areas, they can really cut themselves, which is a problem. I've cut myself quite badly on some of these molds. And imagine how you would feel if you were handed a nice mold to work with versus a shitty mold. To add strength to the piece so it doesn't flex, I add poles. These could be made out of anything that doesn't change. Metals that rust are no good, for example, because they will break. They will change, the size will change, and then they will break off your motherboard. So I use very easily available aluminum broomsticks that I can buy at the supermarket. They're easy to cut, easy to bend to fit my mold. They add strength so the mold doesn't flex, and a place for me to attach bungee cords that I use to hold the two halves of the mold together. And they add something to grab onto when you're trying to get the mold apart. And they're really simple to add. You just add a little bit of fiberglass, and I usually use 2-3 layers to make sure that they're on there thoroughly. And this is exactly the same I would do if I were doing a plaster mold. As I progress through the mold, there will be less and less clay walls to make, as each new piece will butt up against an already created piece. As I mentioned, remember to Vaseline the parts that have already been made, so they don't stick together. And then you rinse and repeat until your mother mold is completed. I skipped showing you a bunch of pieces here because at the end of the day, you will probably not have a similar sculpture, so you can't really copy the mold and expect success with your own mold. But it's important to remember that the principles are the same for every mold. It takes a lot of practice to get good at thinking the way you need to think when making a mold, because it's kind of backwards. You're making something one way in one direction while thinking about how it will come apart in the other direction. So it can be confusing at first, but you'll get there. It's really about just jumping into it and not being too afraid. I taught myself how to make molds in my parents' basement after watching a few videos like this one online, but at the end of the day, you really just have to go do it to get good at it, right? If you wait until you've made a good sculpture to try and make a good mold, I think you're in trouble. Your good sculpture that you eventually will make will be ruined by the lack of your lack of ability to make a good mold. So I think it's a better idea to always try and make molds on the sculptures you make, even if the sculptures are bad, so that once you make a sculpture you really like and you really want to keep, you will be well equipped to make the good mold that your good sculpture deserves. The last step is to drill holes, and I recommend using a bit for concrete or cement. They seem to work the best, instead of using a bit that's made for wood or something, or a standard drill bit. And use a quarter drill, by the way. That's really a good trick. They have a lot more power than a battery powered drill, and they make the job a lot faster and easier. Because drilling through this stuff can take a really long time. I have a pretty good battery powered drill, but I still go borrow the school's quarter drill, and it works way better. I also use wing nuts to make getting the bolts on and off a lot faster and easier. Knowing all the ninja tricks really helps. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I'd like to invite you to take a look at my Patreon page. For those of you who don't know, Patreon is a way for you to connect with me on a more personal level than what we can do here. Here, you're a passive viewer unless you comment and share, of course, so please comment and share. But on Patreon, you can become an active participant. Patreon is a great platform where I can teach you personally, giving feedback on the sculptures you are working on at home. We can communicate over email or by video chat and talk about all things sculpture. So if this sounds interesting, head over to my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below. Consider hitting the thumbs up button or like button and the red subscribe button to see more if you liked what you saw. To get notified when a new video comes out, click on the little bell next to the red subscribe button. In the description below, you can find links to all my social media. Follow me there to see what I'm up to in the studio every day. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.